So in this mini lecture, we're going to talk a little more about bulb propagation in particular. So how can you propagate bulbs? Well, a lot of our tunicate bulbs will actually form natural offsets, and I mentioned that briefly in the last mini lecture when we looked at that cross-section of the bulb. So the cross-section just showed the beginning of the offset formation, but this picture here, you can see these side bulbs forming alongside the original bulb, and those are offsets. So it's very easy to propagate these. You simply just break each of those off and plant them on their own, and they will each become a new plant. Now, some bulbous species will also produce underground stem bulblets. I'll show you a picture of those later. And a select group of species will actually form aerial stem bulblets, and those are specifically called bulbils. And that's what you see in the picture on the bottom right here. That's a stalk that's actually up above the ground, and at the apex you can see a cluster of tiny bulblets there, which again, because they're aerial bulblets, are called bulbils. So, how do these natural offsets form? Well, in the life cycle of a bulb, it goes through both a reproductive and a vegetative phase. During the reproductive phase, this happens in spring. The bulb begins to form the flower primordia, or the basically developing flower shoot. You saw that in the last mini lecture in the cross-section of the tunicate bulb. There was this thing in the center there, and that was the flowering shoot initiating. This flowering shoot will then emerge, grow above the ground, it will bloom, and it will form seed. Now, bulbous species are pretty much never propagated by seed, but that doesn't mean you can't. The reason people don't propagate them by seed is it takes a really long time to get them to flowering size that way. It can take 7 to 8 years before it will grow large enough to flower. And the other thing is it's sexual propagation, so you won't get new plants that looked like the parent plant. So basically the only people that propagate geophytes by seed in most cases are plant breeders, because they're trying to come up with new varieties. Now, once the reproductive stage has passed, then the vegetative stage begins, and this is when our offsets form. During the vegetative phase, new leaves emerge and the bulb grows larger, and it forms offsets. The larger the bulb, the larger the flower that you'll have in the next year. This is why with bulbs you want to leave those leaves on until the fall when they die down to the ground, because that makes a longer period of time that it can photosynthesize and grow a large bulb, or offsets. Now what you see here is a tulip. We start with our original bulb. It actually forms offsets, and for a tulip the original bulb decays and the offsets take its place. Now in North Carolina, at least in central and eastern North Carolina, oftentimes tulips do not come back year after year because it doesn't successfully complete this cycle. What happens is it gets so hot and so humid that that original parent bulb decays before the offsets can form. That's why there's only very few species of tulips that will come back year after year in the south. Otherwise, you just have to plant new ones every year. If you're in a colder climate, then hey, yay for you. Your tulips are coming back next year. This is a daffodil bulb with an offset. And daffodils are a little different than tulips. Tulips, during that vegetative stage, the original bulb decays and new offsets form. With the daffodil, the original bulb actually remains and just grows larger, which means you'll have a larger flower the following year, and it forms offsets. So both the offsets and the original bulb stay, and that's why daffodils usually do come back every year in the south, because you don't have to worry about that original bulb decaying before it can form offsets. It's going to remain, and the offsets will have time to form too. So again, here you could just break off this smaller offset on the side, plant it, and have a whole new plant. If you leave it, you just get a nice cluster of daffodils. Here are those stem bulblets that I mentioned. They can form both above ground and below ground. So the picture on the top left here is a tiger lily, and those little black seed-looking things are bulblets. And specifically, they're bulbils because they're above the ground. They're aerial bulblets. Eventually, these little bulbils will fall to the ground. and they will germinate just like a seed, but they're not a seed, and so it's still vegetative propagation. That means each one of those will produce a plant genetically identical to the parent plant, unlike seed. Now these will take a couple of years before they flower, so 3 to 4 years, but that's still faster than growing it from seed. On the bottom right, you can see some underground stem bulblets that have formed. They're white, and this is also on a lily plant. A lot of plants, particularly lilies, will just form these underground stem bulblets naturally. You can come in, and every single one of those, you can break it off and grow a new plant from it. A way to induce a greater number of bulblets formed on the stem is to dig the whole thing up, leave it exposed for a couple of days, and then cover it up again. It'll actually form more bulblets that way than if you just left it to its own devices. The reason why is when you dig it up like that, the plant thinks, I'm going to die. So it tries to produce as much new bulblets or offspring as it can before it dies, and so that's why you get more bulblets that way. Not that plants really think, but you get the picture. And then finally, here are just some more bulbils, which, by the way, is spelled B-U-L-B-I-L. I know I don't have it on the slide, but it is in your vocabulary games. So what do you think these are bulbils of? If you guessed garlic, you're right. So again, you can see those little red bulbils in that cluster. Each one of those can be taken out and planted to grow a whole new plant. So these are all ways that bulbous species propagate themselves naturally. However, there are some ways that we as people can come in to further propagate more bulbs. For tunicate bulbs, we can use a technique called twin scaling. And essentially what you do with twin scaling is you're cutting your bulb into pieces, and each piece must include 2 scales and a small piece of the basal plate. So you'd come in and make a cut right about there. So here are the steps you want to follow for twin scaling, and this is one of your options for the bulb propagation journal assignment. For twin scaling, like I said before, you are going to cut the bulb into sections, each of which contain 2 scale sections and a portion of the basal plate. Now before you do that, you're going to cut the bulb up quite a bit, maybe into fourths or even eighths. That's going to make it a lot easier to then cut off sections that only contain 2 scales and a small piece of the basal plate. So those are your twin scales. Then you can soak it in fungicide for a certain period of time as indicated on the fungicide label. This is optional, but I strongly suggest it if you want to have successful propagation this way. The environment that you put your twin scales in is the ideal environment for fungus, so if you don't use fungicide, there's a pretty good chance they're going to rot away. So after they've been soaked in fungicide, you place those bulb pieces in plastic bags with either lightly moistened perlite or vermiculite. You can use either one, but it's a very light moistening, about 14 parts perlite or vermiculite to 1 part water. So that's not very wet at all. Again, we're trying to avoid fungal problems. The bag should then be closed tightly and placed in a dark place at room temperature for 7 weeks. So throw it in a drawer or in a cabinet and forget about it. But don't forget where you put it for your journal assignment. That happens every semester. Someone forgets where they put theirs and they can't find them at the end of the semester. So make sure you remember where you put them. And this is what will happen. These are some twin scales that have formed new bulblets. So in between those 2 scale pieces, small new bulblets will form. You can break each of those off and grow a new plant from it. It will take a couple of years to bloom, but this is a really good way to get a lot of new bulblets from a single bulb, which is going to be something you care about if you're growing something that's sort of a specialty bulb. There's a lot of specialty bulb flowers out there that can be very pricey, and so if you know how to do this, you can really increase your stock of bulb flowers without spending a ton of money, as long as you have a little patience. Now, twin scaling is really a modified stem cutting because, again, you have 2 scale pieces and a piece of the basal plate. That's 2 pieces of leaf tissue and 1 piece of stem tissue, and as such, it's analogous to a stem cutting or a leaf bud cutting. It's just a modified sort of stem and leaf tissue. Now, scaly bulbs, you cannot twin scale scaly bulbs. That's only for tunicate bulbs. For scaly bulbs, we use a technique called scaling, which is pretty similar actually to twin scaling. With scaly bulbs, to scale them, you just break off each of those scales. It's very easy since they're loosely arranged. You do not need to maintain a piece of the basal plate. In fact, you really can't if you're breaking off the scales. So while twin scales are analogous to stem cuttings because they contain modified stem and leaf tissue, scaling is analogous to leaf cuttings because those scales are just leaf tissue. Again, you want to soak it in fungicide to prevent fungal growth and rotting. You're going to place them in the plastic bag with the slightly moistened vermiculite or perlite. And may I say, you do need to use vermiculite or perlite. If you use regular potting soil, it will not work. So don't do that for your assignment. It will rot. It just holds too much water. Now, once the bulblets form on your scales, again, you pluck each of them off, you plant them out. Now, sometimes if you want those bulblets to really grow vigorously and flower sooner, they need to have 8 weeks of chilling at about 35 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit before they'll really start to grow. So you can harvest those bulblets, pack them in regular potting soil media that's lightly moist, keep it in your refrigerator for 8 weeks, and then plant them out. So here's what scaling looks like. You take your scale, you put it in the media. In your case, you're just going to put it in a Ziploc bag full of media. And then after 7 or 8 weeks, it'll have tiny scaly bulbs or bulblets forming at the base of the original scaled piece, and you just plant those out. Now there are two other methods for propagating bulbs that I'd like to talk about, and those are scoring and scooping. These are both techniques that involve wounding that basal plate and promoting adventitious bulblet formation through that. Now, scoring and scooping are just used on tunicate bulbs, not scaly bulbs. Scaly bulbs are just not dense enough for this to work. And it's particularly used on this plant pictured here, which is the hyacinth. Scoring and scooping are used on plants like hyacinths that are tunicate bulbs, but they don't naturally produce offsets. And it's sort of a tricky, time-consuming process. This is the way they commercially propagate hyacinths. And so this is why hyacinth bulbs are a lot more expensive than daffodil bulbs. Daffodils form so many offsets naturally that it makes it really easy to get a large number of them very quickly. And even twin scaling them is pretty useful. Hyacinths, they don't respond well to twin scaling. They don't produce offsets, and so you have to use scoring and scooping, and that's why they cost more. So when you score and scoop, if you're scoring, you're going to make a couple of 2 or 3 cuts into the basal plate with a knife, deep enough that you at least get to part of the flower bud, because you want to kill the flower bud. The flower bud, producing the flower bud, is using a lot of that bulb's energy, and you want to redirect it to bulblet formation. So with scoring, you're cutting 1 or 2 straight cuts through the basal plate. For scooping, you actually remove the basal plate from the bulb. And then you leave it with the cut side facing upward for a couple of days or even a couple of weeks so that callus can form on the cut side, and then you put that calloused cut side down in dry sand or some other type of very dry, loose media. It is then incubated in the dark at high humidity, so you could put it, in this case I would really just go ahead and again put it in a Ziploc bag with very slightly moistened peat or perlite, as you did with a twin scale or a scale. And you're going to leave it that way for several weeks until the bulblets form, either where you scooped out the basal plate or along the cuts that you scored in the basal plate. Commercially, they don't waste time going back in and detaching each bulblet. Basically, they just take it out of incubation, flip it so that the cut side is facing up again, and plant it in the ground so that all those bulblets are now facing upward. They're going to produce leaves the following spring, and then after 4 or 5 years, they'll flower, or they'll reach flowering size. So here's what it looks like. I apologize for the weird picture animation there, but just the progression from left to right for scoring. Again, you're going to make 2 or 3 straight cuts across the basal plate, deep enough that touch that flower bud, and then you can see the bright red new bulblets forming in the cut surface. If this was a hyacinth, then you would just plant it in the ground with those bulblets facing upward, but still buried. For scooping, you're just going to come in and scoop out the whole basal plate. A grapefruit spoon is a great tool to use for this. They're using a spoon in this picture, and I don't think that'd be sharp enough. You need a knife, or a grapefruit spoon would be great because it has the serrated edge, but it's an easy shape for scooping. And then you're going to place it again, cut side down in the sand until those bulblets form. And here's what they look like when they form. Then you just plant them again facing upward, and you get your new plants. Or you can actually detach them if you prefer. And here are just some actual photos of bulblets forming on a scored and a scooped bulb. So the left bottom picture, that's a bulb that has been scored, and then the top right, we have some bulbs that have been scooped. So with that, we're going to close our discussion of bulb propagation. You do have a bulb propagation assignment this week. You do also have more mini lectures, but they are on propagating geophytes other than bulbs. When you do your bulb propagation assignment, if you're not coming to campus to get a bulb from us, do not go to the grocery store and buy an onion or garlic and try to twin scale it. It just won't work. I can't explain why, but I've had many semesters now of students trying to twin scale onions, and it just never works. The best thing to do this time of year, because they're pretty widely available, is to buy a lily bulb and scale it. It's very easy. It has a high rate of success, so if you're looking for something to choose, that's what I would recommend.